I want to be clear about something before I start. I am not a hero. I have never been a hero. I don't wear anything that shines. I don't give speeches. I don't wave flags or stand at podiums talking about the dignity of humanity in a galaxy that mostly sees us as a curiosity. An accident species that somehow crawled out of a backwater planet, figured out faster-than-light travel about 40 years after every other civilization had already grown bored of it, and then proceeded to do what humans do best, which is show up places we weren't invited and refuse to leave. That's me, that's what I am, a human who showed up somewhere he wasn't invited. My name is Roan Ashcroft. I'm 34 years old. I'm from a place called Duluth, Minnesota, which means absolutely nothing to anyone outside of about 200,000 people, and even less to the 9 trillion sentient beings currently living across the galactic reach. I run a single-ship salvage operation out of a beat-up Terran-modified hauler called the Marginal Prophet, named that specifically so I'd never get too optimistic. And I spend most of my life flying through the quieter edges of mapped space, picking up wreckage, old cargo, and occasionally taking jobs that nobody else wants because nobody else can afford to lose much if things go sideways. I can afford it, barely, which is why I take the jobs. This is the story of the worst debt collection run I ever agreed to, and the reason I agreed to it was stupid and embarrassingly human, which is to say I needed money and I didn't ask enough questions. Let me back up. 3 standard weeks before the incident, I was sitting in the crew lounge of Station Veilcore with a cold cup of synthetic coffee and a bill for docking fees that was making my left eye twitch. Veilcore isn't pretty. If you've never been there, and most people haven't because most people have better options, it sits in the middle of what the Galactic Navigation Authority calls Sector 9 Transitional Space, which is a polite bureaucratic way of saying, we're not entirely sure who owns this and we don't want to find out. It's a trading post, a way station. One of those places that exists because space is enormous, and sometimes you need somewhere to stop that isn't asking too many questions. The station smelled like recycled air, scorched metal, and something organic that I had learned in my second week there not to identify. The walls were old. Generations of different species had left marks on them, both intentional and otherwise. There was graffiti in 6 languages I recognized, and at least 4 I didn't. The gravity plating was slightly off in the main corridor, so everyone walked with a faint lean to the left, which after a while you stopped noticing. I had been docked there for 11 days. My hauler had taken a hit from a debris field 3 sectors out, nothing catastrophic, but enough to shred one of my atmospheric regulators and crack the secondary hull plating along the port side. Parts were ordered, parts were delayed, and my docking fee was compounding at a rate that made me genuinely angry every time I thought about it. I was on my 3rd cup of terrible synthetic coffee when Thresh found me. Thresh is a Gorakan. If you don't know what a Gorakan looks like, imagine something that was designed by someone who had heard a description of a spider and a crab and a very large dog, and then tried to build it from memory after a long night. They're not aggressive by nature. Actually, most Gorakans are merchants, fixers, information brokers. But they have a particular talent for appearing at exactly the moment when you are most financially desperate, because they can apparently smell financial desperation the way Earth sharks supposedly smelled blood. I have never confirmed whether this is literally true or whether Thresh specifically just had very good timing. He dropped himself into the chair across from me, all 6 limbs folding in that particular arrangement that Gorakans use when they want to seem casual and non-threatening, and set a data chip on the table between us. Ashcroft, he said. His translator gave him a voice like gravel rolling around in a metal barrel. You look terrible. Thresh, I said. You look like something that would eat me. I would not eat you, you would be too stringy. He gestured at the data chip with one of his forward limbs. I have a job. I have a job. It's called waiting for my hull plating. That could take another 3 weeks. Can you afford 3 more weeks of docking fees? I looked at my coffee cup. He had me. What's the job? I said. Thresh explained it the way he explained everything, in pieces, parceling out information the way a person deals cards, slowly, watching your face to see which ones make you react. The short version, there was a debt collection that needed doing. A mid-level broker named Sareth, of Elhari, which is a species that looks like a tall, translucent jellyfish, somehow got a skeleton and learned to wear clothes, had contracted with a small-time crime syndicate operating out of a converted freighter called the Hollowed Saint. The contract was for a cargo transfer. The payment had not arrived. The syndicate, who called themselves the HFY, had decided to pay the debt in an alternative form. The alternative form was a person. "They're offering a slave," I said flatly. "They say indentured asset," Thresh corrected, his mandibles clicking in a way that I had come to recognize as his equivalent of a shrug. "The distinction matters legally in about 6 jurisdictions. In Sector 9, it matters very little." "I'm not a slaver." "No. But Sareth is not interested in a slave. He's interested in the debt. He wants someone to pick up the asset, transport them to his processing hub, collect a documentation fee, and then release the contract upon arrival. The asset keeps their freedom on the other side of that transaction. Sareth gets his paperwork filed. His loss gets written off through a legal loophole that frankly impresses me." Thresh tilted his head. "You would be a courier, Ashcroft, a very well-paid courier." "And what species is this person?" There was a pause, just a small one, but I'd spent enough time around Thresh to know that small pauses were where the things he didn't want to say lived. "Darvani," he said. I put down my coffee cup. "The Darvani." "Okay." So here is what I knew about the Darvani at the time, which was roughly what most humans knew, which is to say a mixture of fact, rumor, fear, and the kind of stories that spread through spaceport bars when people are on their 4th drink and trying to impress strangers. The Darvani were old. Not old the way some civilizations are old, not just been around longer old, but old in a way that most xenobiologists described using words like pre-expansion and anomalous, and in at least 2 published academic papers, frankly impossible given the current consensus on galactic development timelines. They had been spacefaring when humanity was still arguing about whether the world was round. They had watched empires form and collapse and reform from a distance, with the patient disinterest of something that has seen enough cycles to stop being surprised. Physically, they looked disturbingly human, which was its own thing because nobody could quite agree on why. Bilateral symmetry, 2 arms, 2 legs, a head on top, eyes in roughly the right place. The differences were subtle enough to miss and striking enough once you noticed them to lodge in your memory permanently. Their eyes were wrong, not the color, though the color was often unusual, but the depth of them, the way they seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Their skin ran cool and had a quality in certain lights like polished stone. They didn't eat the way most biological species did. And they didn't do well in captivity. Not in the aggressive, violent sense, though that was also sometimes true. In the deeper sense, a Darvani taken against their will didn't fight typically. They went still. They went quiet. They turned something off behind their eyes and became, for all visible purposes, simply absent. The body remained. The person, whatever constituted a Darvani's sense of self, retreated somewhere internal that nothing external could reach. Syndicate traders who had tried to move Darvani captives historically reported that they arrived at destination in perfect physical condition and completely unreachable. Not catatonic, they'd respond to physical stimulus, but empty, like a piece of very convincing furniture. This was, apparently, what had made the HFY syndicate give up and offer this particular individual as debt payment. They'd had her, and Thresh had specified her after a moment, for something like 40 standard days, and she had not said a single word, had not eaten anything they offered, had not responded to anything except the most basic physical interactions, and had begun, in the words of the HFY captain who'd apparently complained to Thresh directly, making the crew feel like they were being watched even when she wasn't looking at them. I sat with all of that for a moment. "How much?" I said. Thresh told me. I said yes before he finished the number. I'm not proud of that. But I needed my ship fixed, and sometimes you make a decision and you figure out whether it was the right one later. The Hollowed Saint was not what I expected, which was good, because what I expected was a rust bucket nightmare held together with good intentions and hope, and what I got was something worse. A ship that was almost functional enough that you could convince yourself it was fine, right up until the moment you noticed the 3rd thing wrong with it and realized you'd missed the first 2. They matched my approach vector about 2 hours after I sent the rendezvous ping, slower than they should have, which told me either their nav systems were sluggish or they were being cautious about who I was. I had my credentials transmitted via Thresh's relay, which was the galactic equivalent of having a mutual friend vouch for you. Not perfect, functional. The Kethvar ran a crew of about 14. Mixed species, I could see 3 different body types in the airlock corridor when they let me dock. The captain was a Ruvari, which is a species roughly the size and shape of a human if the human had gray-green skin, a secondary set of arms that were shorter than the primary ones and mostly used for close work, and a permanent expression of mild suspicion. His name was Vord. He gripped my hand with his primary hand when I boarded. I had mentioned in my credentials that I was human and familiar with physical greeting customs, which always went over well, and gave it a single firm shake. "Ashcroft," he said. "Captain Vord," I said. "I'm here for the Sarath contract resolution." His expression, already suspicious, tightened slightly at something I couldn't immediately identify. Not guilt exactly. More like relief mixed with something uncomfortable that people show when they're handing off a problem they've decided is someone else's now. "She's in cargo hold 3, he said. "She's in cargo hold 3. I held onto that sentence for a moment because of what it wasn't. It wasn't the asset is in cargo hold 3. It wasn't it is in cargo hold 3. He'd used a pronoun without thinking about it, and I noticed the way you notice small things when you're paying attention. "Lead the way," I said. Cargo hold 3 was cold. Not equipment malfunction cold. Deliberate cold. I could see that the temperature regulator on the hold's external panel had been manually overridden and set down to something like 8 degrees Celsius. Someone had made a decision about that. The hold itself was almost empty. Some decommissioned equipment stacked against the far wall. A few containers of what looked like trade goods. And in the middle of the hold, sitting cross-legged on the floor with her back against a support strut, was the Darvani woman. I had seen images of Darvani before. Academic images, mostly, xenobiology textbooks, the occasional news brief. I thought I had a reasonable idea of what to expect. I want to be honest about my first reaction, which is that the academic images had not prepared me for the actual experience of standing in a cargo hold looking at her. She was, I want to use the right word here, and I keep not finding it, still in a way that had weight to it. Not the stillness of someone who has given up, not passive or broken. Something more like the stillness of something extremely old that has learned that movement is optional. Like a mountain, like deep water. The kind of still that isn't an absence but a choice. She was sitting upright, spine straight, hands resting open on her knees. Her hair was dark, not quite black. Something with a blue undertone that I noticed when the hold's overhead light caught it, and it fell loose around her face in a way that looked less like disarray and more like she had stopped caring what it did. Her eyes were open. Her eyes? I said earlier that Darvani eyes absorbed light rather than reflected it. I stand by that description, but what I didn't convey was the texture of it. The way looking at her eyes was like looking down into something that had no bottom. Not frightening exactly, more like vertiginous. Like standing at the edge of a cliff on a clear day, you're not in danger, but your body sends a signal anyway, something old and animal that says this is a place where depth lives. She was looking at the wall. She did not look at me when I walked in. She did not look at me when Vord cleared his throat. She did not look at me when I crouched down to her eye level, which put me at an awkward angle but felt more honest than standing over her. "My name is Roan Ashcroft," I said. "I'm a human from Earth. I'm here to resolve your contract with the Kethvar, which means you'll be coming with me on my ship to a processing hub where the contract gets officially closed. After that, you're free." I paused. I just wanted to explain that clearly before we do anything else. Nothing. Not even a flicker. Behind me, Vord made a sound that was probably meant to be helpful. "She's been like this since we took her, 42 days. Doesn't respond to anything. Have you tried talking to her in Darvani?" A pause. "We don't have a Darvani translator." I absorbed that. "Okay," I said slowly. I looked back at her. "I have one. It's not great. Darvani language encoding is notoriously difficult, and my translator is about 6 years old, and I've dropped it several times, but it has a basic Darvani module." I pulled out the device, a flat disk about the size of my palm, worn at the edges, and switched it to Darvani mode. The display shifted to a set of characters that my translator helpfully labeled as Ancient High Darvani, modern approximation, accuracy not guaranteed. I looked at her for a moment. I said slowly because the translator told me to give it time to render. I mean you no harm. I'm going to get you out of here. Nothing happened for 3 seconds. Then she blinked. It was such a small thing. A blink. But it was the first voluntary physical response anyone on that ship had gotten from her in 42 days, and I know that because Vord, behind me, made a sound like a small, surprised animal. She didn't look at me, but something in her face shifted, not an expression exactly, more like a shift in atmospheric pressure, like the barometric change before rain. All right, I said mostly to myself. All right, let's get you out of this hold. Document reference, personal log Roan Ashcroft, entry 442. Timestamp, 6 hours after departure from Kethvar vessel Hollowed Saint. I gave her the bunk in the forward cabin. The Marginal Prophet was not a luxury ship. It had a crew cabin with 2 bunks, a cockpit, a galley the size of a large closet, a small cargo hold, and a maintenance crawl space that I sometimes slept in when the cabin got too hot, which happened more often than I'd like to admit. But the forward bunk was the better one. More space. A small porthole. I'd put a thermal blanket in there and set the cabin temperature close to what the Kethvar had been running in their hold, because I didn't know if she'd run cold by preference or by biology, and I didn't want to make anything worse. She had walked off the Kethvar without assistance. That surprised me. She'd been sitting on a hold floor for 42 days, and she stood up and walked, steadily, no stumbling, following me through their corridors and across the docking umbilical and onto my ship with the particular quality of someone who has decided to permit this. Not willingness exactly. Permission. Like a stone deciding to be moved. She went into the forward cabin without being shown. I don't know how she knew which one it was. I sat in the cockpit and plotted the route to Sareth's processing hub, 3 days of standard travel, a couple of gate jumps, and tried to organize my thoughts. The thoughts were a mess. Because the thing about making a decision quickly when you need money is that all the questions you didn't ask start surfacing once the decision is already made. I'd agreed to this job knowing she was Darvani. I hadn't asked why she was in Kethvar custody. I hadn't asked how they'd gotten hold of a Darvani in the first place. I hadn't asked whether she had people who were looking for her, or whether there was a history that connected her to any of the various extremely powerful entities in the galaxy who would be upset about her situation. I also hadn't asked, and this was starting to bother me in an abstract way I couldn't quite pin down, why she was alone. The Darvani were not, as a species, known for being loners. They were, as best as the xenobiology literature described, deeply communal in ways that were difficult to fully translate to other species frameworks. Not hive-minded, more like deeply interconnected. Darvani without community did not do well. It was a documented phenomenon. And yet she had been alone when the Kethvar took her, apparently, because Vord hadn't mentioned any other Darvani involvement and the contract was specifically singular. A Darvani alone in Sector 9. I made a mental note to ask Thresh more questions the next time I saw him. I also made a more immediate decision, which was to go to the galley and make something to eat and see if she wanted any of it, because regardless of everything else, she'd been in a cargo hold for 42 days, and I had no idea if she'd had any nutrition in that time. And even if Darvani biology was as different from human biology as some sources suggested, it seemed like the reasonable thing to do. I am aware that make food is a very human response to a complicated situation. I am fine with that. I made rice. I'm not sure why it's not the most impressive thing I can cook, but it was what I had in reliable supply, and it was something that the smell of wouldn't be offensive to most biological species, which mattered on a small ship. I made it with some of the spice blend I'd bought on the station, a mix that a Vehari vendor had sold me by claiming it was universally palatable, which was probably not literally true, but which I'd found decent enough. I put a bowl on the small fold-down shelf outside the forward cabin door. I didn't knock, I just set it there and went back to the cockpit. 20 minutes later, I walked past the corridor again on my way to the maintenance access, and the bowl was empty. She'd eaten it. I stood there looking at the empty bowl for a moment, and something in my chest did a small, complicated thing that I didn't fully examine. I just picked up the bowl and washed it and went about my business. But I made a note to make more the next day. Or the first time in movement on the second day. I was in the cockpit going through the pre-jump checklist, First gate was coming up in about 14 hours, which meant I had to start cycling the drive systems and running diagnostics when I caught movement in my peripheral vision. I turned. She was standing in the cockpit doorway. The marginal prophet's cockpit wasn't large, 2 seats, a bank of controls along the forward panel, screens on 3 sides. The doorway was behind the co-pilot's seat, which was where I kept a pile of spare cables and a jacket I'd been meaning to move for approximately 6 months. She was standing in that doorway with her hands at her sides and her eyes, those impossible eyes, directed at the forward screens. The forward screens at that moment were showing open space. We were in the quiet stretch between systems. No planets nearby, no stations, just the dark and the distant scatter of stars. It was the kind of view that still got me, even after years of traveling. That particular quality of infinite that you don't get in any other context. She was looking at it with an expression I couldn't entirely read. I said carefully, "Good morning," and then, fumbling slightly for the translator, the Darvani approximation of a greeting. She looked at me. It was the first time she had looked directly at me since I'd boarded the HFY. Her eyes were, I've already tried to describe her eyes. I'm not going to do a better job the second time. What I can tell you is that the experience of being directly looked at by someone with those eyes was different from the experience of looking at them while they were looking elsewhere. When she looked at me, I had the distinct, irrational, bone-deep conviction that she was seeing considerably more of me than I was presenting, not in a threatening way. More like being X-rayed by something that had already decided it, didn't need to use what it found against you. It lasted about 4 seconds. Then she looked back at the stars. I turned back to my checklist. We were quiet together for about an hour. It was the most comfortable I'd felt in days, which I didn't entirely understand. Eventually, she spoke. It wasn't anything my translator was going to handle well, Darvani spoken language, as I'd come to understand in those 2 days of carrying the translator around, operated on a different frequency structure than most galactic languages, with layers of meaning packed into sounds that the module approximated rather than translated. What came back through the device was incomplete, fragmented, more suggestion than sentence. But what I got was something like, "There are no stars like this where I should be." I looked at her for a moment. "Where should you be?" I asked. She didn't answer that one, but she stayed in the cockpit for another 3 hours. Document reference, personal log Roan Ashcroft, entry 447. Timestamp, day 3 of transit, 8 hours before arrival at Sareth Processing Hub. Her name was Varil. She told me that on the 3rd day. Or rather, the translator gave me Varil as the closest phonetic approximation of the sound she made, and she didn't correct it, so I went with it. She was speaking more. Not much, a handful of exchanges a day, and everything through the translator was partial and impressionistic. But she was speaking. The retreat had cracked open somewhat, and I had the sense that this was not something that happened quickly for Darvani, which made me careful about it. I didn't push. I answered when she asked, and I let the silences sit when they wanted to. On the morning of the 3rd day, she came to the galley while I was eating breakfast, real eggs from the refrigeration unit. A luxury I allowed myself every 3rd day, and she sat across the small table from me and watched me eat. After a few minutes, she said something. The translator gave me, "You speak to me as though I am a person." I looked up from my eggs. "You are a person," I said. A pause, then the others did not. I thought about that for a moment, about 42 days in a cargo hold at 8 degrees. About a crew that had apparently not thought to try a translator module. "I'm sorry that happened," I said. She looked at me with those deep-water eyes for a long moment. Then she looked down at the table. Then she said something longer, a longer passage through the translator that came back fragmented and partial, but which I pieced together as, "You are a strange thing, human. I have heard of your kind. You arrived in this galaxy like an accident and refused to leave." "That's pretty accurate," I said. Something happened in her face. Not a smile exactly, more like the suggestion of one. The way a flat stone sitting in water makes the faintest movement when a ripple passes underneath. I want to stop here and be honest about something. By the 3rd day, I was starting to feel things that I had not signed on to feel when I agreed to this job. I'm not talking about anything romantic. I want to be clear about that, because it would be easy to read this story that way, and that's not what this is. at least not in that simple sense. I'm talking about the thing that happens when you spend time with a person who has been genuinely wronged and who is choosing, against all reason, to engage with you anyway. The particular weight of that. The particular responsibility. She was real. Whatever the Kethvar had decided, she was asset, cargo, line item in a debt ledger. She was real. And the evidence of that realness was accumulating in my small cockpit and my small galley and the empty rice bowls outside the forward cabin every morning. And I was transporting her to a processing hub. I kept sitting with that. I kept checking my navigation and reminding myself that the contract was going to close at the hub and she was going to be released, and that was a good outcome, technically, legally, practically. She would be free. I would be paid. Everything would be resolved. She was in the cockpit again when the long-range scanner picked up the processing hub. I watched the signal resolve on the navigation screen. Sareth's operation was bigger than I'd expected. The hub registered as a modified orbital platform, mid-range, with docking capacity for about 20 ships. There were currently 9 vessels docked or holding pattern. One of them was giving off a military-grade navigation signature that I couldn't quite identify. Something about that bothered me. I couldn't immediately say why. Varel was looking at the screen. I noticed that her stillness, that deep water quality, had changed slightly. Something was different in the way she was holding herself, a tension that hadn't been there. "Does anything about that station look familiar to you?" I asked, knowing it was a strange question. The translator took a moment. Then she said something, and what came back was that signature. The Kethvar told someone where I was going. I looked at the screen more carefully. The military-grade signal was on a ship positioned between the hub and the exit vector. Not docked, holding position. Holding position in a way that looked a great deal like a gate. "Varel," I said slowly, "I need to ask you something directly." She looked at me. "Why were you alone in Sector 9? A long pause, the longest she'd given me. When she spoke, the translator worked harder than it had at any point in the previous 3 days, and what came back was still fragmented. But there was enough of it that the picture assembled itself slowly, piece by piece, like someone describing a photograph they weren't supposed to have seen. "Separated from my people, long journey." A purpose she described with a word the translator rendered as something between mission and obligation and inheritance. A failure, not hers, but someone else's, that had left her without passage. The Kethvar had found her before she found her alternative. "What was the purpose?" I asked. She was quiet for a moment. "Then to return." "Return where?" She looked at me for what felt like a long time. And then she said something that the translator handled in a way that made me go completely still. The translator rendered it as, "To the seat of my house. I have been lost for a long time. My house believes me dead." House. In Darvani, the translator's contextual note helpfully added. The word she had used for house carried connotations that in human equivalents would be rendered as dynasty, bloodline, or in formal historical contexts, royal lineage. I stared at the screen. "Varel," I said carefully. She looked at me. "What exactly is your house?" She told me. I'm going to pause in the testimony here, because I want to convey accurately what happened in my body when she told me. I had heard of the Darvani great houses. Most people who had any interest in galactic history had heard of them. They were the closest thing the Darvani had to a formal governance structure, and even calling them that was an oversimplification, because the great houses weren't really a government in any sense that most civilizations would recognize. They were more like the deep structure beneath everything, the bones under the surface. There were, by historical record, 9 great houses. 8 of them were active, publicly known, and accounted for. They maintained embassies, they had formal relationships with the Galactic Reach Authority, they appeared in the background of every major political development in the last 1,000 years as a kind of permanent, patient, unchanging presence. The 9th house was the subject of about 300 years of debate among Darvani scholars and galactic historians. Because the 9th house had vanished. Not died out, not been destroyed, vanished. 700 years ago, give or take, because historical dating in the galactic context is complicated. The 9th house of the Darvani had simply ceased to be publicly present. No final records, no dissolution ceremony, No statement of any kind. They were there, and then with the quality of a candle going out, they weren't. The other 8 houses had never formally declared them extinct. Scholars had argued for centuries about whether that was meaningful, whether it meant they knew something. The 9th house was called, in the translation my module provided, the House of Deep Silence. And Varel, who had been sitting in a cargo hold on the Kethvar for 42 days, eating nothing, speaking to no one, going so still and quiet that she might as well have been furniture, told me that she was its last surviving heir. Lost for 300 years. Looking for a way home. I'll be honest, my first thought was, this is not what I signed up for. My second thought was, and yet here we are. My third thought, and this is the one that I keep coming back to when I replay this in my head, was something simpler and less articulable. Something that cut through the logistical panic and the financial anxiety and the practical catastrophe that this information represented. Something that was just the recognition of a fact. She'd been lost for 300 years. 300 years. Alone. Cut off from her house, her people, her entire context. Carrying an obligation she described as something between a mission and an inheritance, trying to find a way home in a galaxy that mostly didn't know she existed and hadn't noticed she was missing. And she'd ended up in a cargo hold. And nobody had spoken to her in 42 days. I sat with that for about 30 seconds. Then I looked at the navigation screen with the military-grade signal holding position between us and the exit vector. Then I looked at Varel. I want to be clear about what I was up against, practically speaking. I had agreed to deliver Varel to Sareth's processing hub in exchange for a fee that was going to fix my ship and clear my docking debt. Backing out of that contract wasn't just financially catastrophic. It would flag my registry, potentially invalidate my Sector 9 transit permits, and make Thresh very unhappy, which was its own category of problem. The military-grade signal between me and the exit vector was from a ship I still hadn't identified, which meant either it was private security, Sareth's, possibly, or it was something to do with Varel specifically. If it was Varel specifically, if the Kethvar had told someone her destination, and that someone was now waiting at the hub, then the situation was no longer a simple contract resolution. It was something else entirely, and the shape of what that something else might be was starting to form in a way I didn't like. I pulled up everything I had on Sareth. The broker's reputation was in the way of mid-level galactic brokers, mixed, reliable on standard contracts, a little aggressive on debt recovery, known to be thorough about documentation. There was nothing in the public profile that suggested any particular interest in the Darvani. But the contract itself, I pulled it up again and read it more carefully than I had the first time. The language about the asset was more specific than I'd registered. The processing hub destination wasn't just any hub. It was a facility that Sareth operated specifically for cultural asset management and registration. Which was, I pulled that phrase up in the Galactic Commercial Database, a category of business that handled, among other things, the formal documentation and transfer of individuals or objects with historical or cultural significance. Not slaves, not quite, but something adjacent, something that existed in the legal space between person and artifact. A Darvani alone in Sector 9. Last surviving heir of a lost royal house. Delivered to a cultural asset management facility. With a military-grade vessel holding position at the exit vector. I sat back in my seat. Varel, I said. She was looking at the navigation screen. That tension was still in her, the new tension, the one that had appeared when she'd seen the military signature. Do you know who sent that ship? I asked. She was quiet for a moment, then she said something and the translator gave me, haltingly, one of the other houses. They learned I existed. They want what my house carries. What does your house carry? A long pause. The original records. She said something else, a longer phrase, and the translator gave me a string of fragments, the histories, the first covenants, the proof of what was agreed before the expansion, before the reach, before the 8 houses decided what the 9 houses had been. I thought about that. They're coming to take something from you, I said. They want to ensure it never reaches the seat of my house. Where is the seat of your house? She looked at me. And for the first time since I'd found her on the Kethvar, she told me directly, without hesitation or pause. She gave me a set of coordinates. My navigation system didn't recognize them. That meant they weren't in any current map database. That meant wherever the seat of the House of Deep Silence was, it had been off the galactic map for the same 300 years that Varel had been lost. I looked at those coordinates for a long moment. Okay, I said again. I want to tell you what it's like to decide, in real time, to blow up your financial stability, your professional standing, and your contractual obligations all at once. It's quiet mostly. There's no dramatic music, nobody cheers. You're just in a small cockpit on a ship with a patched hull and a synthetic coffee maker, and you enter a new navigation course, and the system asks you to confirm, and you confirm it. That's all. That's what a life decision looks like from the inside. I put the marginal profit on the new heading, away from the hub, away from the military vessel's holding position, on a vector that used the system's gravitational geometry to change course without triggering an obvious departure signature. It wouldn't fool anyone for long, but it would buy me minutes, and minutes in this situation were worth something. I opened a channel to Thresh. He answered on the 4th ping, which meant he was either asleep or in a meeting, and had decided to pick up anyway. His voice came through the comm with that familiar gravel barrel quality. Ashcroft, he said, you're 11 minutes ahead of projected arrival, efficient. I'm not arriving, I said. A pause, I'm sorry. I'm not delivering to the hub, I'm withdrawing from the contract. The silence that followed had texture to it. Ashcroft, Thresh said slowly, do you understand what withdrawing from the contract means? I do. The fee. I know. Your permits. I know. Sareth will. Thresh, I cut him off. I know all of it. I'm doing it anyway. I need you to listen to me for about 90 seconds because there are some things you need to know, and then I need you to make a decision about whether you want to be involved. Another pause. And then, because Thresh was many things but he was not, when it came down to it, stupid, he said, go ahead. I told him what I'd found out. I told him about the coordinates that weren't on any map. I told him about the House of Deep Silence. I told him about the military vessel and what Varel had said about the other houses. I told him, as clearly as I could in 90 seconds, that I was transporting someone that 300 years of galactic history had decided didn't exist, and that there were powerful entities in this sector who apparently wanted to ensure it stayed that way. When I finished, Thresh was quiet for about 10 seconds. Then he said, you are a spectacular idiot, Ashcroft. Yep. You realize what the great houses represent in terms of Thresh, the political implications alone. Thresh, what do you need? And there it was. Because Thresh was a Gorakan information broker who had survived 30 years in Sector 9 by being very good at calculating risk and reward, and he had apparently just run those numbers and arrived somewhere that surprised me. I need the military vessel's registration, I said, whatever you can pull on it. Give me 4 minutes, he said and cut the comm. Varel was standing at the edge of the cockpit doorway. She had seen me change course. She had heard the comm exchange. I hadn't tried to hide it, partly because there wasn't really anywhere private on the marginal profit, and partly because it seemed wrong to make decisions about her situation without her being aware that decisions were being made. She was looking at me. We're not going to the hub, I said. She said something. The translator gave me, I know I saw the heading change. Are you all right with that? A pause, then something that the translator gave me as, you are breaking your contract for me. Yeah. Why? I thought about that for a moment, about what the honest answer was, about the 42 days and the cargo hold and the 8 degrees, and the fact that the people who had held her there hadn't even tried a translator. About 300 years of being lost, about what it meant to be carrying something, a history, a covenant, proof of something that powerful entities didn't want proven, across a galaxy that had largely decided you didn't exist. Because you're a person, I said, and what they were going to do to you at that hub wasn't right, and I knew that. I knew it when I took the job, and I didn't think about it hard enough, and I'm thinking about it now. She looked at me for a long time. Then she said something that the translator took longer than usual to render, working through it in fragments, In my house, there is a word. For the one who acts rightly when it costs them something. For the one who sees what should be done and does it without being required to. A pause in the translation. We do not have many words for humans. We will need one now. I didn't know what to say to that. So I turned back to the navigation screen and kept flying. Thresh called back in 3 minutes and 50 seconds. The vessel holding at the exit vector is registered to the House of Velsathar, he said. His voice had taken on a quality I recognized as the specific timbre he used when the information he was relaying was making him personally nervous. The fourth house of the Darvani Great Eight. The fourth house, I said. They are one of the most politically active of the eight, heavily involved in galactic governance affairs. They have a formal embassy on the Reach Capital station. He paused. Ashcroft, what is on my ship? A person, I said. A Darvani person. Yes. Connected to the ninth house. I heard him working it out in real time, the mandibles clicking. Ashcroft, he said, the ninth house. Yeah. The lost house. Yeah. The house that the other eight have been maintaining cannot exist for 300 years, because if it exists, he stopped. What, I said, if it exists, what? A long pause. Thresh. I need to do more research, he said. But Ashcroft, if the ninth house has a surviving heir, and if that heir is carrying what certain historical sources have suggested the ninth house carried, then there are implications for the political structure of every great house, including the four who have seats on the Galactic Reach Council, including the fourth house, which is currently sending a warship-grade vessel in your direction. A pause. How fast can your ship go? With the patched hull plating, not fast. That is a problem. Yeah, I looked at the navigation screen, the new course, the coordinates Varel had given me. Thresh, how many gate relays are between me and these coordinates? I read them off. The silence on the other end was significant. Ashcroft, he said slowly, those coordinates are not in any current database. I know. You can't navigate to coordinates that aren't in the database. The gate system doesn't. I know. I glanced at Varel, who had moved to the co-pilot's seat and was looking at the forward screens. I may have some help with that. Another long pause. I am going to add a significant amount to my prayers tonight, Thresh said. Whatever their form for you. They picked up our new heading 11 minutes after we changed course. I know that because that's when the comm request came in. I didn't answer it. The request repeated 4 times, then stopped. Then my navigation system flagged a tracking signal from the Velsathar vessel's direction, military grade, the kind that doesn't ask permission. They were not catching up yet. The marginal prophet had one genuine advantage in this situation, which was that she was small and her signature was messy. The patched hull plating actually helped here, in a deeply ironic way, because it scattered my emission profile and made my exact speed and heading harder to pin down from a distance. A larger, cleaner vessel was easier to track from the outside because it was predictable. I was neither. But they were faster, and they would narrow the gap. I needed the gate. Varel, I said. She looked at me. The gate system. Can you, I know your coordinates don't have a registered jump point, but is there a way to get to them? Any gate that's near enough that I could calculate the rest of the jump manually. She was quiet for a moment. Then she moved, actually physically moved, leaning toward the navigation console in a way that made me instinctively pull back to give her room. She looked at the screen. Her hands, and I'd noticed over the 3 days that her hands were always held very still, deliberately controlled, moved to the console's surface. She didn't touch the controls. She just held her hand above them, close enough that I could see the screen's light catching on her skin. She said something long and continuous, and the translator gave me a waterfall of fragments. Third gate. The old relay, not active on your maps. It was decommissioned in the record systems, but not physically, never physically. It runs on frequencies your survey ships would have read as ambient noise. The Darvani used it long before the expansion. It remains functional. A pause. I can show you the harmonic. Show me, I said. She held out her hand, the first time she'd initiated physical contact of any kind, and I understood what she was asking. I gave her the translation device. She held it for a moment. Then she spoke a sequence of sounds that my translator made no attempt to render into words because they weren't words. They were numbers, frequencies, a harmonic code. The translator captured the audio. I took it back and ran it through the navigation system's frequency analyzer. The system processed for about 30 seconds. And I want to be clear that I have talked to 3 separate engineers about this since, and none of them have given me a satisfying explanation. The navigation system found a signal. The signal corresponded to a gate relay. A gate relay at a position 12 degrees off my current heading, and about 40 minutes at current speed. It was not in the database. It showed up as pure astronomical data, a physical structure, registered by the sensor suite as exactly what gate relays look like when your sensors are close enough and looking for the right thing. I looked at Varil. She was already looking at me. "I told you," said her expression, which, now that she'd decided to have expressions, was doing considerably more work than it had been 3 days ago. "Adjusting heading," I said. "Document reference, personal log Roan Ashcroft, entry 452. Timestamp, en route to unlisted gate relay, Velsathar vessel closing." Here is what I was thinking about, in the 17 minutes between adjusting heading and reaching the gate relay, while also monitoring the Velsathar vessel's closing distance and running my systems at everything they had. I was thinking about what Thresh had almost said. If the 9th house has a surviving heir, and if that heir is carrying what certain historical sources have suggested the 9th house carried. He'd stop there, because I knew Thresh, he'd either hit the edge of what he knew, or he'd hit the edge of what he was comfortable saying on an open comms channel. I was thinking about what Varil had said, the original records, the first covenants, the proof of what was agreed before the expansion. Before the expansion, the galactic expansion, the period when the existing spacefaring civilizations had developed the current gate network and established the political frameworks that eventually became the galactic reach. That was about 800 years ago, give or take. By the time humanity had arrived, late to the party as usual, the basic structures had been in place for centuries. But the expansion had a before, and in that before, the Darvani great houses had existed in a different configuration, with different agreements, different structures of authority and precedence, and I was inferring here, but the inference felt solid, different distributions of political power. If the 9th house had records of that time, if they had documentation of what was actually agreed before the expansion reconfigured everything, and if those agreements were materially different from the arrangements that the 8 remaining houses had been maintaining for 800 years. Then what the House of Velsathar stood to lose, if those records surfaced, was not just political inconvenience. It was legitimacy. I looked at the nav screen. The gate relay was 20 minutes out. The Velsathar vessel was 36 minutes out. I had 16 minutes of margin. That was, in salvager math, enough. 3 things happened in the last 3 minutes before we hit the relay. First, the Velsathar vessel opened a broadcast channel. Not a direct comm to me, a broadcast on the open frequencies, which meant they intended it to be heard by anyone in the area, which in this case was just me. The message was formal in the way that messages from great houses are always formal, which is to say it had the quality of something that was a threat presented as a courtesy. It asked me, requested was the word used, which meant required, to halt and return the cultural asset in my possession for proper registration and transfer to recognized authority. Cultural asset. The same language as Sareth's processing hub contract. Not coincidence. I didn't respond. I had already said what I needed to say to Thresh, and there was nobody else in this immediate space worth talking to. Second, Varil spoke. She said something that the translator gave me as, "They will say I am unstable, lost and without context. They will say I require protection and supervision. They have said this before of other Darvani who carried things they did not want carried." "I know," I said. "Do you understand what you are doing?" "Not entirely," I admitted, "but I have a general idea and I've decided it's worth the unknowns." She was quiet for a moment. "You are very strange, human. I've been told. Your species, I have observed your species from a distance for a long time. You are inconsistent. You argue with each other constantly. You make terrible decisions with great regularity. You are frequently wrong about what is important." A pause. And then occasionally, with no warning and no apparent reason, you do something like this. Like what? Like choosing rightly, at significant personal cost, without being asked. The translator labored, "It is confusing." "Yeah," I said, "I know we confuse ourselves too." Third, the gate relay appeared on the forward screen. It looked old, in the way that things look old when they were built by a civilization that understood what it was making and built it to last regardless of whether anyone would be watching. The structure was dark, not lit, no active status indicators. But the shape was unmistakably a gate relay. That particular architecture of curved receptor arms and central transit chamber that someone had apparently arrived at independently across multiple civilizations. Because it showed up in Darvani, Ruvari, and pre-expansion Vihari construction, with enough similarity that xenoarchaeologists had been arguing about convergent engineering versus cultural contact for 200 years. The frequency harmonic Varel had given me was broadcasting from the translation device through my comm system, aimed at the relay's receiver band. For about 4 seconds, nothing happened. Then the relay lit up, section by section, from center to edge, like something waking from a very long sleep. The light it used was not the blue-white of modern gate relays. It was older, a deeper color, something between gold and amber, that did something unusual to the quality of the space around it. The transit chamber opened. "Here we go," I said to nobody in particular. And I flew the marginal prophet through. Document reference, personal log Roan Ashcroft, entry 453. Timestamp, post-transit, unknown space, coordinates, per Darvani navigation record. Gate transit normally felt like nothing. That's the thing most people don't tell you. You expect something, some sensation, some physical awareness of having crossed an enormous distance in no time at all. And instead, there's just a brief visual flicker and you're somewhere else. Your body doesn't register it because whatever the gate system does to move you, it doesn't involve your nervous system's threat detection. You just go from here to there. This was not like that. This was, I don't have the engineering vocabulary to describe what happened, and the readings my instruments took during the transit gave 3 of my engineers migraines when I showed them later. What I can tell you subjectively is that it felt like passing through something that had weight to it. Not physical weight, something more like temporal weight. Like moving through a place that had a lot of time accumulated in it. It lasted about 2 seconds. Then we were through. And the space on the other side was different. The stars were different. Not dramatically, I wasn't in another galaxy. My instruments confirmed that we were still within galactic bounds. But the arrangement was wrong. The star density, the spectrum distribution, the background radiation signature. Wrong in a way that told me we had come through somewhere that the modern galactic map had never documented. And the reason it had never been documented was not because it hadn't been found, but because someone had made sure it stayed off the map. The marginal prophet drifted for a moment in the new space, systems adjusting, instruments recalibrating. And then Varel made a sound. It wasn't translated. It didn't need to be. It was the kind of sound that doesn't require translation because it lives in a frequency that every species with a nervous system recognizes. Something between a breath and a word. Something that means home without being the word for it. She had her hand on the cockpit window. On the forward screen at the edge of instrument range, something was resolving. A structure. Not a planet, or rather, not just a planet, because there was a planet. A world with the particular blue-gray color of deep oceans and high altitude. But around it, integrated with it in a way that human engineering had never attempted, was architecture. Something that had been built over so long a time, and with such thorough purpose that it had ceased to be distinct from the world it orbited, and simply was part of it. The seat of the house of deep silence, which had not, as it turned out, been lost, which had been hiding. Document reference, personal log Roan Ashcroft, entry 453, continued. Timestamp, approach to Darvani Station, designation unknown. They hailed us before we got within approach distance. The hail came through on frequencies my comm system needed a moment to find, and when it resolved, the voice was, I don't know how to describe it properly. The Darvani language sounds different spoken by native speakers outside of a transit translator situation, and I was getting it in real time through the module, which was working very hard. What I got through the translation was formal and careful and very, very still. Something like, identify your vessel and purpose. Varel answered before I could. She spoke for about 40 seconds. I didn't get all of it through the translator, but I got enough her name, rendered in full Darvani form, which was considerably longer than Varel, a sequence of what were probably lineage identifiers, and then something that I caught clearly at the end, a phrase that translated as I return with the records. I am not alone. I was found by a human. He brought me home. The silence on the other end of the hail lasted about 8 seconds. Then a new voice came through, older quality, slower, and the translator, working at maximum effort, gave me something that felt less like a sentence and more like a tone. Welcome. Welcome. We had not given up hope, but we had been waiting a long time. Varel's hand was still on the cockpit window. I was looking at the world ahead of us. I was thinking about a lot of things. About Thresh. About Sareth and the contract I'd just blown up. About the Velsathar vessel that was presumably now sitting at an inactive gate relay trying to figure out what had happened. About the hull plating that still needed fixing. I was also thinking about what Varel had said. He brought me home. Just that, no embellishment, no formal language, just the fact of it stated plainly in whatever Darvani inflection served for matter of fact. I found I didn't mind that. You all right? I asked. She looked at me. And for the first time, the actual, genuine first time since I had found her sitting cross-legged in a cargo hold at 8 degrees with her back against a support strut, she smiled. It was not a human smile. It used different muscles, had a different geometry, held a different meaning. But it was unmistakably the expression of someone who has found, after a very long search, exactly the thing they were looking for. Yeah, I said softly, all right. I'll tell you what happened after. Not all of it, some of what happened after is still, several standard months later, being negotiated by people considerably more important than me in rooms that I have no access to and wouldn't know what to do with if I did. But I can tell you the parts that involved me directly. We docked. The marginal profit was, carefully, deliberately, with a precision that suggested the Darvani stationed at the approach had been doing this for a very long time, guided into a berth that I was reasonably sure had never had a human vessel in it before. The architecture of the docking facility was built to a scale and in a style that was both completely alien and somehow exactly right. The kind of thing that you look at and understand immediately is purposeful, without being able to explain how you understand it. Varel left my ship. She walked out of the marginal profit and onto the dock and the people there, the Darvani waiting, standing with a quality of stillness I now recognized, were still for a moment when they saw her. And then something happened in the air of that dock. Not something I can describe physically. Something that was more like a pressure change, like the moment before rain, but the rain was something other than water. She turned back once before they surrounded her. She looked at me. She said something that the translator was too far away to catch. I raised my hands in a gesture that I hoped conveyed I don't have the device on, and she seemed to understand. She said it again, louder, and the translator caught the edge of it. The seat of my house is in your debt, Roan Ashcroft of Earth. I stood there in the airlock of the marginal profit with my jacket half-zipped and my 3-day stubble and my patched hull plating, and I said, "Don't worry about it." Which is, I recognize, an extremely human response to being told that an ancient royal house of one of the oldest species in the galaxy is in your debt. But it was what I had. She smiled again. And then they were around her, and she was home, and I went back into my ship and sat in the cockpit and stared at the screens for about 20 minutes doing nothing. Then I opened the comm. "Thresh," I said. He answered immediately, which meant he had been waiting. "Ashcroft, you're alive." "I'm alive." "You went through an unlisted gate." "Yes." "With a Darvani royal heir." "It appears so." A long pause. "Where are you?" "I have no idea. My navigation system is rebuilding its reference framework. Somewhere that's been off the map for 300 years. I paused. "I think everything's going to be fine. There's going to be a lot of political noise. The Velsathar house is going to have a difficult few years. Some things are going to change." "Because of you," Thresh said. "Because of her," I corrected. "I just gave her a ride." Another pause. Ashcroft, Thresh said. About the contract, I've already contacted Sarath. I told him the asset was released per the contract terms, which is technically accurate if we don't specify the location of release. His documentation is filed. You won't be flagged. I blinked. How did you? I'm very good at my job, Thresh said. Also, I may have spent the last several hours researching the 9th Darvani house, and concluded that being on the correct side of this situation was worth certain professional accommodations. I laughed. I hadn't laughed in about 4 days, and it came out rougher than I expected, but it was real. What about my hull plating? I asked. A pause. I have received, Thresh said carefully, a formal communication from a Darvani station, coordinates I do not have registered in any database, indicating that certain repair services would be provided to the vessel Terran Registry TRS 7741 Delta as a courtesy. I did not ask for clarification on the details, because I decided it was better not to ask for clarification on the details. I looked at the marginal profits hull status monitor. 3 of the repair notifications that had been red were now yellow. I stared at that for a moment. Okay, I said. Go home, Ashcroft, Thresh said. Yeah, I said, working on it. I got a message eventually. Not through any channel I recognized. Through the translation device, the old worn one I carry in my jacket pocket, which one morning started displaying text in Darvani characters that the module rendered slowly into something approximating English. It was short. The records have been received by the Galactic Reach Authority. The first covenants have been entered into the historical record. The political process will take time, it always does. But the thing that was hidden is hidden no longer. The House of Deep Silence acknowledges the one who acted rightly when it cost him something. We have made a word. In our tongue it is long and carries many layers, and I will not try to translate it in full here. But its simplest meaning is this. One who sees another truly and treats them accordingly, without being required to. We give it to you as a name, Roan Ashcroft of Earth. Use it in good health. I read it in the cockpit of the Marginal Prophet, somewhere in the middle of Sector 7. With a fully repaired hull and a full synthetic coffee cup, and the stars moving past the forward screen the way they always do, patient and enormous and entirely indifferent to the small things happening in front of them. I sat with it for a while. Then I thought about 42 days in a cargo hold. About empty rice bowls. About someone going so still that they might as well be furniture, because the alternative was feeling what was being done to them. About 300 years of carrying something alone, looking for a way home, in a galaxy that had mostly decided you didn't exist. And about how sometimes the most important thing in the world is just someone speaking to you in your own language. Just someone saying, I mean you no harm, I'm going to get you out of here. Just that small thing. I put the translation device back in my jacket pocket.